This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. Well, often on Curious Minnesota, we are answering questions about something in Minnesota history. But in this episode, we're talking about a place that has played a big role in history and is also at the center of what's been happening in Minnesota recently. Over the years, we've gotten a lot of questions about the history of Fort Snelling, and today seems like the right time to dig into that. I asked reporter Chris Vondracek to look into this for us, and he joins me now. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Erica.
Thanks so much for being here.
Of course.
When you first were tackling this, I was trying to think of my own memories of Fort Snelling and visiting with my kids. Did you grow up and go to field trips at all?
I did. So I grew up in southern Minnesota, and in sixth grade, we had a statewide kind of history class and did a giant tour of the state. Then we finally got down to Fort Snelling, and I had written a paper. It was supposed to be a 5-page essay on Fort Snelling, and I was so obsessed with Fort Snelling that I wrote a 15-page paper.
Wow. Overachiever.
Yes, as like a little boy who I was interested in castles and that kind of thing. But we didn't have any castles in Minnesota, but we did have Fort Snelling. And so I think it became an object of my curiosity.
Oh, so interesting. So first, obviously, Fort Snelling is a fort. That's in its name. But what exactly does that mean, and what are the different parts of the place?
Totally. One scholar I spoke with basically told me to think about this in terms of like presents, right? And not like Christmas presents, but presents in terms of like appearance or even power. And so in the early 19th century, there was, westward expansion, quote unquote, manifest destiny was on the minds of this young nation moving out from the East Coast west of the Mississippi. And so there was an effort to start to flex this country's power. And there were sort of two elements that were of interest to the country's leaders in DC at the time. And one was the fur trade. That was in kind of what we call the old Northwest area of like the Mississippi River Valley and up through the Great Lakes. But then, of course, there was sort of the indigenous nations, the peoples that were out here, Ojibwe, the Dakota, the Ho-Chunk, and further west, the Lakota. And at the time, Zebulon Pike, who was this kind of American adventurer type, sort of illegally negotiated with a dozen or so Dakota representatives. Only a few, like fewer than 5, agreed to this treaty, if we can call it that. This kind of like botched treaty that was eventually ratified by the Senate. And there were over 100,000 acres of what became the Fort Snelling Military Reservation, which basically encompassed currently where the fort is, the airport, the Whipple Federal Building, as well as like South Minneapolis, all the way to today, kind of modern downtown Minneapolis. The Senate gave $2,000 in traded goods for this stretch of land that Zebulon Pike figured was at least worth $200,000.
Got it. So really an unfair, problematic beginning for this federal outpost. What were the first things that were built there?
Well, yes. Apparently, the first encampment there at the Fort Snelling site at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, which the Dakota called Bedote. Essentially, that site was just like an early camp called New Hope. And then they started building what we know of today as the fort, these sort of 19th century buildings, including the iconic round tower that in 12-year-old Christopher's mind looked most like a castle.
Right. So was it like a little town?
Yes, like that area of Minnesota along the rivers was like a pretty cosmopolitan area, stretching back to like the 18th century. And so definitely not just was there like a military presence there, but you had folks who were buying and selling furs. You would have had what at the time we would have called Indian agents arriving to do negotiations or transactions with the region's tribal peoples. And so there was kind of a community, a settlement on the bluff for sure.
Got it. That makes sense. So you touched a little bit on the fact that it was a sacred place for the Dakota, but I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what it was like before Mr. Pike got involved.
Totally. So when I spoke with Indigenous scholars from the University of Minnesota, they talked about the ways in which these waterways were essentially our modern day interstates. And so this would have been a key area for trade.
Right, because it's right where these two major rivers meet, the Minnesota and the Mississippi.
It wasn't just kind of this uninhabited grassy bluff in the upper Mississippi River Valley. I mean, it certainly was teeming with life. So it's a very much a beautiful meeting space.
And I know that the fort has been at the center of Minnesota's history and even the United States history through the years. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Harriet and Dred Scott.
Yes.
I visited the fort this summer with my family, and there was a really interesting, living history talk about what their life was like there.
Totally. Yeah. Dred Scott, one of the most iconic names attached to a dishonorable or ignoble, infamous U.S. Supreme Court case that essentially upheld slavery in the country, precipitating into the U.S. Civil War. And so Dred Scott himself, as a man, was an enslaved person who was assigned to a federal officer with the U.S. who came to Fort Snelling. And, we think about the North and the South. One did not have slavery and one did have slavery, but there certainly were exceptions. And Fort Snelling was an interesting place where essentially people who were slave owners and slavers, if they were assigned at Fort Snelling, they would be legally allowed to bring their enslaved person with them.
Yeah.
And so in that case, Dred Scott came to what we now know of as Minnesota and Fort Snelling and lived there. And he met and ultimately wed Harriet. And Harriet had a similar story, was from Virginia, and she was enslaved. And they were married, I believe, in the 1830s. But eventually they end up in Missouri petitioning for their freedom because their enslaved owner, he has passed away. This petition ultimately wound its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the court, in just an infamously bad ruling, basically said that any rights that a white man has are not the rights of a black man or woman. They said that Dred Scott could not get his freedom. But this history, this exception all comes back again to Fort Snelling and its unique place in kind of as a federal military camp that had sort of different strictures and different kind of legal status than the land around it.
And that brings us to the Civil War. And what was that time like at Fort Snelling?
Right. So Fort Snelling never did see a battle. I remember reading through history textbooks when I was, again, on this middle school project, but I was looking for some battle and there was no battle.
Yeah.
But it sort of served its purpose, right? And being this presence again of the US government. And in the Civil War, anyone who's ever studied the ties to Minnesota know that Minnesota was the first state to kind of volunteer troops to the Union cause. There are soldiers who are enlisting up and down the Mississippi River valleys. A lot of them would have been coming to Fort Snelling for that in the early part of the war. And then perhaps most iconically, though, in that time period of the Civil War, what folks in Minnesota are thinking about, at least beginning in 1862, is we now call the U.S.-Dakota War.
That was a major event in our history. Can you talk about that?
Right. So at hazards of simplifying a contentious and difficult history, essentially the Dakota who were hemmed in on these reservations were being starved because the rations were being withheld to come to them because of the war effort. And so essentially fighting broke out in southwestern Minnesota. And it was a really difficult and bloody time for the state, for the Dakota people, and ultimately a tragic conclusion was the culmination of that winter. And there was, in late December of 1862, there was the hanging of 38 Dakota men plus 2 indigenous people in Mankato. And then there was sort of the forced relocation of prisoners of war. And these would have been not just warriors, but also women and children who were sent up and live in a concentration camp.
And that was at Fort Snelling.
Yeah, for a winter. And as one scholar told me, he thinks of it as saying that 1,500 or 1,600 people went into this camp and roughly 500 did not come out.
My God, that is so sad. What a terrible chapter in our history here. I'm curious about what role the fort played in the wars that followed. We're going to get into that after the break. Curious Minnesota is going live this spring. We will be recording live at the Strib Outdoor Adventure for All event on Saturday, May 9th at the Trailhead at Theodore Wirth Park. It's a celebration of Minnesota's abundant natural resources and recreation opportunities. Send us your best questions about Minnesota's outdoors, and we might feature your question at the event. Send them to curious@startribune.com. Thanks. We're back, but before we continue our conversation, I wanted to tell you that this podcast is produced by Melissa Townsend and the music is by Matt Gilmer. So what did the fort become in the 20th century?
So during the World Wars, World War I and World War II, Fort Snelling was a common place for Minnesotans to go enlist in the armed services to do the fight against, fascism abroad. And then in the mid 1940s, before the end of World War II, it became this site for Japanese language learning. Of course, there was the war that the U.S. had in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan, and there was an effort to build up people who had low language skills in order to decode or kind of listen to messages that were happening across the Pacific at the time.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then the U.S. military decided to decommission Fort Snelling.
So what does that mean to decommission it?
Basically, that would have been the kind of end of the run of Fort Snelling as a military site. Keep in mind, too, with Fort Snelling, you have not only what we think of today as historic Fort Snelling, which if you have Legos, you can build like the round tower and the barracks and the buildings up on the bluff. But you also had, again, this massive 100,000 acre military reservation that over the century essentially had been, or century plus, had been kind of whittled down increasingly. The international airport comes in the early part of the 20th century. And so you have an airport there. You also have the Fort Snelling National Cemetery where veterans are buried. You also had the Veterans Administration, the VA services were there, and other governmental agencies are still sort of operating out of this campus, but it's increasingly getting smaller and kind of boiled down into this tongue-tied name called the Fort Snelling Unorganized Territory is kind of its title. And in the mid 1960s, they decide to build a federal building there. And in 1969, they give it a name, thanks to a bill from Senator Mondale. It's named after the very first Episcopal bishop of Minnesota, Bishop Henry Whipple.
And what was it originally built? Was it federal offices or?
Yep. Yeah. Just sort of a smattering of federal offices. Again, it had sort of VA services. At one point, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services operated out of there.
Got it. And so we've been hearing so much about the Whipple building because it houses an immigration court. And then during this ICE surge, the agents are bringing people there and detaining them. And some of our reporters have written about some truly disturbing conditions there as it suddenly changed use in this way.
Right. So the Whipple building today has become kind of the headquarters of the ICE operation. And there were, these iconic, troubling shots, video of federal agents lined up in sort of riot gear against, everyday workaday Minnesotans in parkas and maybe bullhorns. And there was tear gas and there was explosions. And Whipple has also become this kind of detention center. And so that's what a number of the scholars I spoke to said has this echo of history.
Right. Being a place where people are being held, there is a sense of history repeating itself with the historic fort nearby.
Yes. People who are being rounded up, the federal government has said it's the worst of the worst. I think most reporting has shown it. A number of just peaceful people who have overstayed a visa or were just protesting and then were detained and apprehended and brought into this essentially this kind of ad hoc prison, this detention center, and then sometimes held for hours, days, maybe, perhaps longer without legal rights being immediately or quickly sort of recognized. And so they're being held there without access to attorneys in some instances. And the particular echo that was particularly striking for, I think, for some people in the community was when the Ogallala Sioux Tribe president, that's a tribe in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, had to come out and put out a statement saying that there were 4 OST members who had been detained at Whipple by Homeland Security. When you think about how Fort Snelling even came into being through essentially a largely illegal treaty, is just ripe with ironic sadness for many members of the community.
As an educator and as somebody who's indigenous from these lands,
I know that one of the scholars you talked to is a professor named Nick Estes from the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and he spoke about this very point at an anti-ICE rally on January 23rd in downtown Minneapolis.
I like to tell a little bit of history because that fort, Fort Snelling, when it was built in the 19th century, it was built to genocide our people. It was built as a concentration camp, as a projection of U.S. power in this region to genocide indigenous people and Dakota people. From the very first stone they laid in that fort, Dakota people resisted. And we will continue to resist until they remove the very last stone from that fort. Because all of you today are now feeling what we have been feeling for centuries.
It continues to exist, just as it did 160 years ago. It's kind of the major presence of federal government action, particularly with this Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota's backyard.
I was also curious about the name. What's the story there?
Yes. During the first Trump administration, during the first kind of more aggressive posture or action toward removing undocumented immigrants in the U.S., there had been a group of Episcopal leaders and Native activists who kind of joined together in the Twin Cities to say, we want Bishop Whipple, who was seen as a somewhat humane, moderating force in the 19th century. He had personally written to Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, to say, please do not execute the 300 plus Native Americans they had initially wanted to be tried and sort of executed for the U.S.-Dakota War, show some restraint. And so that number was whittled down to 38. And so Bishop Whipple was seen by some to still kind of retain this patronizing view of Native Americans in the 19th century, but also at that time, a more humane view, again, sort of remembered fondly in that light as kind of forward thinking. And so I interviewed the bishop of the Episcopal Church in Minnesota, who basically said that for many people, the idea that Whipple's name is on this building, that this name should be removed because he's rolling over in his grave, so to speak.
Got it. Is there anything else that you learned as you looked into this question? Anything that surprised you?
Gosh, again, the entire concept of the Fort Snelling Unorganized Territory was absolutely baffling to me. There are actually 300 people who live still in this kind of unincorporated community.
Wow.
So that remains fascinating to me.
Yeah, there's so many layers. Well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been really helpful.
Thank you for having me on, Erica.
And thanks to everyone who sent all those questions about Fort Snelling. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com. And if you have feedback or a question you'd like us to answer, send a note to curious@startribune.com. Until next time, stay curious.